low, steady rumble of the engine echoed off the dense timber as Marcus guided his truck up the winding, switchback roads. He loved the way the four-wheel drive pulled effortlessly through the steep inclines, the heavy tires chewing through the loose gravel. It had been a long, grueling week of work, and he desperately needed away from the noise and the screens. The suspension of the pickup settled as Marcus cut the engine. The nose of the truck pointed toward the fading light at the edge of the remote mountain trailhead. He just wanted a quick, out-and-back hike to clear his head before the sun dropped completely below the gorge. He sat in the quiet cab for a moment, the heat radiating from the dark dashboard. The weathered paint of his truck looked almost completely matte in the heavy, stretching shadows of the late afternoon. Back down the mountain in town, the evening commute was probably just reaching its peak, a chaotic tangle of brake lights and blaring horns. He had promised he'd be back in time for dinner, just needing an hour or two of absolute isolation to let his mind untangle. Marcus stepped out of the cab. Locking the heavy steel doors, the electronic chirp of the horn was instantly swallowed by the vast, overwhelming expanse of the woods. He adjusted the collar of his jacket and stepped onto the packed dirt path. The air was crisp, carrying the deep scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The shadows were already lengthening, stretching across the gorge like dark, reaching fingers as the temperature began a rapid descent. For the first mile, the only sound was the steady rhythm of his own boots against the packed dirt. He fell into a steady, marching cadence, letting his mind wander, trying to focus only on the rhythmic crunch of gravel and dirt beneath his heels. The terrain began to shift, sloping downward into a steep ravine. But as the trail dipped into a deep hollow, where the canopy of old-growth oaks choked out the remaining daylight, the forest grew unnervingly quiet. It wasn't just a gradual fading of evening noise. It was a sudden, stark absence of life, as if a heavy blanket had been thrown over the mountain. The ambient chatter of squirrels and the rustles of foraging birds vanished entirely. The hair on the back of Marcus's neck prickled. The woods were never this silent, unless a large predator was actively hunting. He slowed his pace, his senses heightening, listening intently to the void. Then came the crunch. It was subtle. A single dry leaf compressing under heavy weight, about 30 yards to his right. Marcus stopped. He held his breath, his eyes scanning the impenetrable wall of briars and thickets. He listened to the wind sift through the upper branches. Nothing, he told himself. It was just a white-tailed deer settling into the brush for the night, or maybe a stray dog that had wandered too far up the ridge. He gripped his thick wooden walking stick a little tighter, rolling his shoulders to shake off the creeping paranoia. He started walking again, deliberately picking up his pace. A few seconds later, another sound. Snap. It wasn't an echo, and it wasn't a squirrel. Whatever was out there was pacing him, moving parallel through the dense mountain laurel. Marcus kept his eyes fixed forward, but strained his peripheral vision. Every time he took a step, the unseen entity matched it. Through the gaps in the brush, a low, tawny shadow glided over a fallen timber. It moved with a terrifying, fluid grace, no bobbing, no heavy footfalls, just raw muscle rolling under a sleek coat, a cougar. The reality of the situation crashed over him like a wave of ice water. Eastern mountain lions were supposed to be ghosts of the Appalachian Ridge, rarely seen and almost never aggressive toward humans. But this was no ghost. This was an apex predator, and it was actively stalking him. Marcus's pulse hammered against his throat. He knew the survival rules. Don't run. Don't turn your back. Make yourself look big. But the sheer, primal terror of being hunted screamed at every nerve in his body to sprint. He fought the urge to bolt, forcing his boots to stay planted in the dirt. He gripped his heavy walking stick with white knuckles and deliberately struck it against a thick pine trunk. Thwack! "Hey!" he shouted, his voice echoing sharply in the cold hollow. The shadow stopped. For a grueling minute, Marcus stood frozen, staring into the dark brush. The silence was deafening, broken only by the frantic thumping of blood rushing in his ears. He couldn't see the cat, but he could physically feel its gaze. A heavy, calculating pressure boring right through the laurel. Slowly, agonizingly, he began walking backward up the incline of the trail. Keeping his chest squared to the woods, he calculated every placement of his boot, desperate not to trip, desperate not to show weakness. Every time he took a step, the brush shifted. It was closing the distance, using the changing shadows of the sunset to mask its approach. The trailhead parking lot was a quarter-mile away. Marcus backed up the steep slope, his breathing fast and shallow. The ascent burned his thighs, and his hands were trembling so violently he could barely keep his grip on the walking stick. He dared a quick glance over his shoulder to check the path behind him. It was a fatal mistake. His heel caught on an exposed root, and he stumbled backward, his arms windmilling to keep his balance. In that fraction of a second of vulnerability, the brush parted. A massive, flat head emerged from the shadows. Pale, unblinking yellow eyes locked dead onto his. The cat let out a low, vibrating hiss that sounded like tearing canvas, exposing teeth that gleamed in the fading twilight. Its front shoulders dropped low to the dirt, coiling like a spring. Marcus didn't freeze this time. He hurled his walking stick directly into the brush, turned, and broke into a dead sprint. Adrenaline flooded his veins, blurring the edges of his vision as he tore up the trail. The silence of the forest was instantly replaced by the violent, heavy crashing of undergrowth right behind him. He could hear the heavy, rhythmic thumping of the cat's paws, tearing up the damp earth, closing the gap with terrifying speed. It wasn't a pursuit, it was a countdown. He burst through the tree line into the gravel clearing. The dark paint of his truck reflected the last sliver of the sun. Salvation was 50 yards away. He could picture the interior, the absolute safety of pulling that heavy door shut and hitting the deadlocks. He ripped his keys from his pocket, his thumb scrambling for the unlock button as he ran. But his hands were shaking too hard. The plastic fob slipped from his sweat-slicked fingers, striking the gravel and skittering underneath the truck's chassis. A scream of pure, desperate frustration tore from his throat. Marcus dropped to his knees, his arms scraping against the sharp rocks as he reached frantically beneath the vehicle. He could hear the rapid thud of heavy paws hitting the clearing just behind him. He stretched his arm as far as his shoulder joint would allow, feeling the sharp gravel biting into his skin. His fingertips brushed the cold plastic of the fob. Then, a crushing weight slammed into his back, driving him flat against the gravel. The impact forced the air from his lungs in a violent rush. He didn't even hear it jump. The sheer kinetic force of the 200-pound animal pinned him instantly to the earth. the heavy claws sinking through his jacket and deep into his shoulder blades. The last thing Marcus felt was a sudden blinding pressure at the base of his neck, before the forest faded back into absolute, undisturbed silence.